welcome to the Modern Cyber Podcast. We are thrilled to be back with another episode today. My name is Jeremy Snyder, founder and CEO of FireTail, and as always, I will be hosting this episode. Today, I am thrilled to be joined with a guest from the other side of the world where I actually happen to find myself as well. But Toby Amodio is joining us from Australia. Toby has a long history in cybersecurity. He's led large, diverse, geographically dispersed teams to protect, detect, and respond to the cyber challenges facing government. So I know we're looking for some really interesting perspectives there. Toby has previously held the Chief Information Security Officer roles at Australian Parliament House, the Department of Parliamentary Services, and the Australian Taxation Office. And he's currently consulting with MF and Associates, a Fujitsu company, into the Australian federal government. Toby is a father to two young kids and is constantly trying to balance work, life, and compliance. I know a lot of us are trying to balance work and life, but adding compliance into the mix has got to make things a little bit more complex. Toby, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
It's a real pleasure. And especially, given that I am traveling on this side of the world and talking to a number of customers and partners here in Australia and across kind of the broader Australasia region, one of the topics that comes up is regional compliance and regional standards. And one of the things that is in a lot of headlines recently is the Australian Essential 8. And there was kind of an update to it last year that I was reading up on. I know there's been many updates to it over the year, but I wonder if you could, for the audience, just give us some context of what is the Essential 8? How did it come about? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We'll talk about all those things, but maybe set the stage for the listeners.
Sure. I'll jump in. And before we jump in, I'll just mention that all my opinions are that of myself and not my employers or the government. But Absolutely. That aside, the Essential 8 is an amazing beast. But we'll start one layer higher. As a government agency within Australia, you get money from the government to deliver services to the country. And an obligation of that is to comply with the Protective Security Policy Framework. And it's an overarching framework that tells you how you do physical, personnel, cyber, and security governance as a whole. Now, that's the overarching framework. Underneath that, it's got a number of different policies and objectives. One of the policies under the PSPF is to do the Essential 8, and one of the policies is to implement the Information Security Manual. Now, the Information Security Manual and the Essential 8 are two documents developed by the Australian Signals Directorate, and that's our intelligence agency. The interesting part about the intelligence agency developing the documents is, obviously, they've got some insight into how to compromise other agencies, and they also see a number of how agencies get compromised. And so they wrote the Information Security Manual effectively as the control Bible on how to protect yourself. Based off their experience.
They're aware of the threats. They know what, let's say, the top risk vectors are. And so that informed a lot of their thinking and let's say, their analysis that went into this, right? Correct.
So that's the ISM is the Bible. It's over 800 controls at the moment, and it gets updated quarterly. So it is constantly evolving to the threat landscape. Now, the thing that they've done, they've been delivering it for over 15 years. I think this dates myself. It's over 20 years. And as that has evolved, they've also realized that it's increasingly hard to implement 800 controls in a risk-based manner. And so about 10 years ago, they had to come up with they thought we'd come up with a more consolidated list. And that's where they came up with the Essential 8. And the Essential 8 was the 8 top mitigation strategies. So not controls. Unfortunately, it maps to 200 controls. But the mitigation strategies that they saw to mitigate over 80% of intrusions that they saw against Australian government entities. So they went, if you do these 8 strategies, it'll mitigate against the main intrusions that we see. Now, that was when it was first created. And the interesting thing about this is it was created by the intelligence agency to help secure the rest of the country, but it's now molded into a compliance piece that's mandated under the Protective Security Policy Framework, which is a very pass-fail implementation. So they were trying to do it originally as a guidance thing to say, hey, if you can't really focus on the whole ISM 800 controls, then just focus on these things because the most incidents that we see, they're affecting these things. So do the basics brilliantly and you'll protect against the majority of the incidents that we see. Now, the 8 is actually part of 37 mitigation strategies. It's a whole beast. So it's confusing as hell. And on top of that, they did a maturity model against the Essential 8, and you've got 4 levels of maturity against each of the 8 controls. The complexity on this is absurd, and it makes it extremely hard to implement. But the concept is 8 strategies to do, mitigates 80% of intrusions.
Okay. And along those lines, I mean, one of the parallels that comes to my mind as you described it is actually something called the OWASP Top 10. And a lot of people look at the OWASP Top 10 as if it were, let's say, a compliance checklist or a framework that they can use. But I don't really see it that way. To me, it's more of a threat model that says like, hey, these are your top 10 risks. And, there's the one for applications and then there's one for APIs, which is the one that I run into, of course, running an API security company on a regular basis. But part of the challenge that lies therein in the fact that it's not a controls framework is that the controls are then variable to every organization. Because let's say, for instance, the way that I use cloud is different from the way that you use cloud. And the way that I might need to look at, let's say, cloud identity security, if that were one of the 8, I know it's not, and we'll come to that in a second, but the way I would look at cloud identity security may be quite different from yours. And then for the same time, for an external auditor or somebody who came in and wanted to, let's say, assess my maturity relative to the essential 8, they're looking at, an apple over here and an orange over here. And so, those two things are not the same. I guess this is kind of part of that complexity that you're getting into when you say it's like a nightmare to implement.
Yeah, 100%. And it's one of those pieces, increasingly my role in a CISO role became not just reporting against risk, but then reporting against compliance and reporting against maturity. And there were 3 independent lenses. And ideally, you should just be looking at risk, going, what are the threats that we face? And then how do we align our controls to those threats? But then as an entity that is assured by external entities, you have compliance obligations. So you have to meet those bars. And then inevitably also your compliance maturity is always in context of other agencies or other entities. So it's not just like, are you a 4? It's, are you a 4, but where are the other people? And so I find that those 3 kind of concepts all boil around whenever I was doing reporting up, not just a pure compliance lens against, as you said, a fixed or semi-fixed framework or a conceptual lens.
Yeah. And I mean, I know there's one of the common sayings that you'll hear in many security conversations, especially when a compliance person enters the room, is security is not compliance and compliance is not security, that they're 2 very different things. And like, ultimately, compliance is very prescriptive, whereas like security is always a risk management exercise. And I guess one of my first questions is like, A, do you think that most people understand that here? And B, when you think about like the everything that you've laid out, let's say from the ISM and the 800 checks, and then the subset of 37, and then the essential 8 and the maturity model, like, does it all get kind of very messy and muddled in people's minds where they don't really know where the risk management piece leaves off and then the compliance piece picks up, and how they do and don't work together?
Yeah, 100%. And it becomes reduced to a really simplified conversation, especially in the media, of just do 8 things. It's simple, just do 8 things. And as you said, that doesn't take into account your risk posture. The example I always used to use is when I was at the tax office, if we implemented the Essential 8 perfectly, but had a cross-site scripting vulnerability on one of our websites, we would technically be compliant with the Essential 8, but we could be pumping out all of our data. Or an Optus where they had an open API, that's not one of the Essential 8. That breach, which leaked tens of millions of client records, their Australian telecommunications provider, again, outside of scope. And so it's about going, well, realistically, what's the lens that we do on top of it? And so, but it also becomes really hard because you've got a compliance lens against these 8, which are very hard to do. And then that can consume a lot of your information security program. So that will actually detract from your other risk management activities.
Right.
Because if you're spending millions and millions and millions trying to get Essential 8 compliant, then that may detract from your application security or your API security approach.
Yeah, and as you said, in your overall risk management, if you kind of think of the broader threat model around your organization and where your risks lie, if they're not part of the Essential 8, which really leads me to, one of the other questions. And by the way, I would be remiss here if I didn't say, hey, Optus, if you're listening, please give us a call. We're more than happy to help you out. But on the side of, like, let's say what's not in the Essential 8, I know one of the things that's been called out is that really there's almost nothing in the Essential 8 relative to cloud. And that's whether infrastructure as a service, software as a service, But here we are, recording in 2024, and that's where the world is or is moving towards. One, how do you think about that? And what was your reaction when you saw the latest update and that wasn't in there? And then two, like, what kind of reaction are you hearing from, let's say, like, no specifics, but some of the organizations that you talk to on a regular basis? How are they thinking about this? And like, does that in their mind diminish the value of the Essential 8, that it's not really representative of the current state of IT?
Yeah, increasingly, it was originally created, as I mentioned, focused against those risks of the time and the threats of the time. And it is primarily aligned with threats of intrusion into your system, which is, as you said, focused on that more on-prem, thick client relationship piece. And as we move into the cloud, identity and policy is more increasingly the boundary. And so it would be interesting to me for the Australian Signals Directorate to almost release an update that then contextualizes, does this still address 80% of the cyber risks that they see? Like, is it still aligned? And if that would be a good refute of, well, the rest you can get in the ISM, you don't need, this is what we still see. Or if they turn around and go, no, we've updated it and you're right that the threats are now focusing more in that information and access plane, like the most recent Microsoft vulnerability where they got compromised by misconfigured permissions in a dev tenancy and all that jazz. So as you know, identity is the boundary. And so I think it's worth them almost coming to the table and going, hey, well, we still see these ones as the main pieces, or no, the risks, that the vulnerabilities that we're seeing, or the attacks that we're seeing, the incidents, have shifted our 8 and now we've got these 9, or you know what I mean? So
yeah. Look, I mean, it's so hard because Essential 8 is such a catchy thing, and if it, a lot of the times I know that cybersecurity programs seem overwhelming, and especially they're overwhelming to people who are new to an organization, and you step into an organization for the first time, either as, let's say, an entry-level employee, somebody working as the prototypical SOC analyst kind of entry-level cybersecurity role, or you're like just joining an organization, maybe you're coming from a smaller one to one that's a much higher profile and a bigger target, it can be really overwhelming. And if you don't have good cybersecurity principles in place, and then you're trying to tackle a program, it's great to think about there's 8 things, it's manageable, it's a small list.
Correct.
Not to spend too much time on it, but, tangent from my past is I worked on cloud security for a long time. And there is, especially with customers that I worked with in the US, there's the NIST 853 guidelines. Mm-hmm. And it's roughly 400-ish controls, 450 or so, if I remember correctly. And that's super overwhelming. And so most customers would never want to start with that unless they had an absolute requirement to do that. What do they do instead? They love the CIS benchmark, the Center for Internet Security. Why? Because it's like 40 controls and it's super prescriptive. And I can literally go down a checklist and think about it and, literally go one by one. So I guess my question is, like, when you think about approaching this with new organizations that you either step into or that you're talking to for the first time, how do you counsel them? Do you say, hey, let's start with the 8? Do you say, hey, let's start with your threat model? Do you say, like, no, it's got to be some hybrid of like the 8 plus a risk model applied to your org? Or how do you start that conversation?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I used to have a saying that simplicity is the key, so all can see. And that's the Essential 8 definitely hits that. It hits the simplicity thing. I usually start with the threat lens, predominantly when I'm in an organization. But as I mentioned before, it's that risk piece needs to be passed through the lens of compliance for the organization and what they have to achieve. And if they are a government entity or they want to engage with government entities in Australia, then the Essential 8 is a great starting point and it's a great kickoff. And as you can see from the nature of the controls, especially, it's effectively patching applications, restricting administration privileges, application control, and then doing a number of hardening pieces and then ensuring you can recover. So it is a pretty broad swathe of protect, detect, respond. And that's usually the language I use as well. The ISM actually has govern, protect, detect, respond. I know that the NIST cybersecurity framework has 6 at the top layer. I try to embed that kind of language as well to simplify the conversation so that the executive can understand really key what we're trying to achieve with each function and break it that way rather than starting with a control framework. Start with a narrative piece. And my preferred narrative, execs simple, and I say that as a former exec. Simple things, protect, detect, respond. usually gets you across the board to articulate what you're going to try and do, and then you just focus on what the key things are you want to do in those spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Look, that makes a ton of sense, and I think I would certainly support your overall approach towards keeping it simple, especially when you're starting off. Because if you try to bite off too much at the beginning, it becomes a very demoralizing exercise very, very quickly. A couple of other things I noticed from from my very brief cursory reading of the Essential Eight, mind you, is that one of the things that I found was not in there. You mentioned that proper usage of admin rights was called out well, and multi-factor authentication is called out well as well. But then, least privilege as an overall identity and access management principle seem to be lacking. And so, when you think about especially data access across distributed environments, if my account has too much data access and then I get compromised through a phishing email or what have you, there's a potential risk there. I didn't see that one in there. And the other one that really struck a chord with me was that I didn't see configuration management in there. And especially we talked a second ago about the kind of the cloud first world that we're in. Everything is software defined and almost everything is configuration based at this point. That seems like a real miss to me.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I do think that the restricting administration privileges should evolve into least privilege, like universal least privilege. And increasingly within the greater ISM, there is a focus on zero trust, and zero trust is really geared around that least privilege, universal least privilege assurance. So I think that increasingly that's where it will go. But you're right, it is a miss in my opinion, but they are focusing again on the greatest threat point, which is those admin roles and what they can do in the organization. But has that kept pace with the nature of what an admin is in the modern cloud environment and how diverse that is? Because that's the other piece that people don't realize, which is the nature of what an admin used to be, with literally a sudo or a DOM admin account.
Yeah.
Now you can jerry chain a whole heap of auth privileges within apps, and then all of a sudden you've got a domain administrator or enterprise administrator by proxy. But to the other piece as well that you're talking about, I think that the configuration management and hardening, they have a catch-all called application hardening, and I think as well, that one to me, it's focused on the core apps that have been popped in the past, like our web browsers, our Office suite, those core pieces that they've seen nation-state actors focus on. But I do think that could be expanded out to, as you know, the S3 buckets, the standard configuration layers, looking at how cloud you harden the perimeter and then create a defense in depth throughout the application stack as well to ensure that you have a least privilege and harden controls and follow things like the SIS baseline or hardening configuration guides from the providers. So I completely agree, but I also think that there is tweaks of two that are in there already that you could use to achieve that. So it'd be interesting to see if they approach that in the future. Yeah,
that's fair that there's tweaks, but then, a follow-up question that I would always have along those lines is, to what extent do the people actually doing the implementation work understand that this is a tweak of one of these guidelines that they need to kind of incorporate? That when they're looking at application hardening, they also need to be looking at, let's say, the infrastructure that an application is running on in AWS, because by the way, that application can be running on an EC2 instance that has an assigned user role or an assigned IAM role that might have admin rights, right? And so, it's a question of how deep the understanding and sophistication is.
Oh, 100%. The devil's in the detail. And as you mentioned, it's hard because once you simplify things up to just 8 concepts or whatever, it obfuscates the detail so far that it's not practically aligned to what the actual outcome is. And it's an intractable problem. There's a saying I used to have, which is the only thing that's important as a CISO is knowing what's important. But then the more important thing than that is the only thing that's important as a CISO is being able to then communicate what's important. And as you said, tracing that traceability down to from the concept down to the actual implementation is critical. And it's hard. It gets lost a lot of the time within organizations from the translation from concept into implementation, and that's problematic to say the least. And as you know, the defender's dilemma is that we have to succeed every time, and the attacker only has to succeed once. And the challenge that I would have, and I put to you, is I used to joke that I should have gotten to physical security because the locks aren't updated every 3 months. There isn't a monthly patch cycle for the physical locks. I know my physical security brethren, that they have a hard time, don't get me wrong. But for me with the Essential 8, because it's getting updated quarterly as well, I'm constantly trying to chase that new bar. And so it's not having one conversation, it's having multiple conversations. And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but one of my biggest challenges in my career was I became into a CISO role, and I said to the security board, if you give me X amount of money, I'll get you to maturity level 2 on the Essential 8 by next year. And I'll do these things to achieve it. I did all the things on that list to achieve it.
And the target moved.
And the target moved. So when we got there, I got to the board next year, I said, I spent all your money, I did all the things, and we're now at maturity level 0. And they were not very thrilled with that outcome. And I hadn't brought them along for that journey, but it is one of the challenges of the constantly evolving nature of cybersecurity and our threat environment. And how do we ensure that we move from a point-in-time governance, risk, and compliance model to a real-time assurance model that validates the controls on a regular basis and automates the remediation of them? Because as you said, configurations down into the nuances of how a specific implementation of EC2 is done, we should be automating them as much as possible, both for the detection and the remediation, because otherwise we're never going to be able to achieve this. So increasingly for me, it's how does the security governance lens work hand in glove with the security operations to not just assure them on paper, but ensure that they're embedded in an ongoing basis and that we can automate those remediations as much as possible.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's a couple of points in what you said that I want to dive into. The first of which is that, talking about that journey that you went on where you had an X budget to achieve Y outcome that was on the maturity scale. That's a really interesting way to look at it, because one of the challenges that I get from a lot of people around cybersecurity in general, and this is across like almost anything, is it's very hard to measure cybersecurity results. There's one measurement that really matters, which is, hey, did we get breached?
Yeah,
right?
Did we get popped?
But then and it's that question that you often get, honestly, with like general practitioners on the medical side. It's like, how much do you pay or reward or value your GP when you don't get sick, right? And so this model in cybersecurity is like, it's a very thankless job 99% of the time until you have the one bad day. Hopefully it's just the one bad day a year or whatever, year, decade, whatever, that the time frame that you want to measure is. Where, as you said, you have to be right kind of continuously all of the time. But when you bring that, that is a measurable result, but it doesn't necessarily apport a positive ROI on a year-by-year basis. And so it's very easy for people who make funding decisions to look at that and say, oh, well, you didn't get popped. Clearly, you don't need any additional budget. And so there's almost an argument to be made that you need a little bit of breach in the organization to kind of justify continued investment into cybersecurity. I mean, I see you nodding and laughing because you must have gone through this conversation.
Nothing pads a cybersecurity program like a breach. And funnily enough, this is 100% been a focus of my career, which is how do you report your improvement into the organization, and then how do you show ROI on your outputs? Now, there are some like tangible, specific examples I can show where we've removed costs to the organization, like removed fraud from a business lifecycle flow chain. And those are really good, positive one-offs, but they're not an ongoing piece. One of the ways that we did it is, and this is a big shout out to our US counterparts, but we, at one of the organizations I was at, used the National Institute for Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework and did a CMMI assessment against it. And that gave us a score out of 5 for our maturity against not the overarching cybers, and then each of the 6 domains under the new model. Yeah. And we found that was really helpful to have a conversation with our board about, if you give us 10 million, it puts us up 0.1. And it also gives us a mean about the average for, we worked with a Big Four partner who had done a lot of these, but it meant that we could get government across the world is at a 3.8. Yep. So then we could go, well, we're actually at a 3.9. So our investment's probably right sized at the moment. But if you want to go to best in breed, the best in breed is 4.1 and each increment costs X. And we use that as a justification to go more of and that's that maturity piece where how do you compare with your brethren? because I haven't found a really good, like, I know that there's some people that play in the market around a breach costs this much money, so the amount of days that we haven't caused a breach is saving you this much money, but I feel like those are just esoteric. And then, unfortunately and depressingly for cybersecurity professionals, a lot of the stock market results have bounced back quite well after breaches. So I don't think it's actually an enduring cost to a number of the publicly listed companies. And so it's about how do you quantify the dollar value of trust, and how do you report that within your context of your organization?
This brings up a really good point, because one of my observations, and this is me completely speaking as an outsider, so correct me on this, is, in a lot of the conversations that I've been having with customers and partners here locally, one of the things that I'm hearing pretty consistently is, oh, we just had our worst year for breaches ever. There were these really big ones. We mentioned Optus, but there was MetaBank and Latitude Financial and one or two others that are not coming to mind. And I haven't deeply researched the Australian New Zealand market or Australia in particular on a country basis to know, what is the rate of data breaches. I'll tell you from a US perspective, there are a dime a dozen. They're happening every day. And to your point, there's very little financial penalty either from the regulators or from the financial markets. And, I'd say most organizations assume that most like larger US publicly traded organizations assume that they either are or will be breached. And any kind of fines or credit monitoring, identity theft prevention to the consumer is just built into the overall model. They maybe get cyber insurance around it, et cetera. But one of the things I've heard is that the regulatory fines here are pretty brutal, and they've been very serious. And I've heard from people that it feels very much like an overcorrection, which may or may not be viewed as a positive thing, depending where you're sitting and how you feel about it in your own role in organization. I mean, what's your reaction to all of that?
I think it's a really timely. I think that your assessment, especially across the US implementation, is right on the money, and I don't think it's having necessarily a positive trend on the control posture, because I do think that there are a number of bean counters who think that they can just bean counted away or balance it out in the greater run. But it has been reflected in, so the Australian government recently put in securing critical infrastructure. All of the Five Eyes countries, so Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, and USA, have very similar approaches to securing critical infrastructure. A lot of their key policies mirror. And so we're constantly changing ours in line with the US, but we've actually gone a bit more hardline. And the lens on that is similar to the tax office here, which is support the people that are trying to do the right thing and punish the ones that aren't, if that makes sense. And so if you are engaging and trying to do the right thing, then they will give you all the support to the end of the world to fix it. But if you're willfully not engaging with it, then they've given themselves the tools and the freedom to be able to undertake actions to encourage compliance and alignment. And I think that approach of the hug, where people are trying to get support, but then punish where people are being willfully non-compliant, is a really good balance, and is a bit more pragmatic. It's not just attacking people for, like, the old, you wouldn't blame someone for getting punched in the pub, so I don't know why we blame people that get breached. So this is similarly, if someone's getting punched in the pub, it's only if they keep going to the same pub all the time and they wear a shirt that says punch me that we start going, hey, maybe you should stop doing this. But otherwise, we're going to put the wraparounds in to protect them. And I know I'm stretching that analogy very wide.
But look, I think the point is taken. Look, and I don't want to get too deep onto this in today's conversation, because we've got other episodes where we've been talking about the U.S. regulatory environment recently, and some of the personal liability that's coming along with it. That, to your point, is kind of putting blame towards the people who got punched in the pub. And, in some instances, to kind of stretch this analogy even further, got blindsided by a person who was sent in there by a mafia boss to go punch somebody, not random, punch one particular targeted person in a pub. And then that might have the knock-on effect of punching thousands of people across thousands of pubs. So I think that point is well taken. And I'm glad to see that this kind of a response is what's seeming to happen. I'm curious from how much of that has been kind of correlated with consumer data protection. I'm half American, half European. I've lived in both sides of the pond for a lot of my life, in addition to some time spent in Singapore. And GDPR, as a European citizen, feels very good to me in terms of protecting my own consumer data. How much has consumer data protection factored into this conversation around either supporting organizations or assessing the scale of a fine towards an organization that does get breached?
Very strongly, and they, as you may know, they've got the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner here, whose only role is to assist with data breaches and guideline entities to respond and manage their data appropriately. And that has been baked into the new critical infrastructure as well. And they've actually expanded it.
Okay.
They've gone, look, we recognise that PII is critical, but they've also gone, it's bigger than just the PII. It's also the systems that manage that PII, or the systems that manage the delivery of services to the public, and we have to make sure that we've got the appropriate wraparounds for all of them. I think that there are a number of, I think the balance in Australia is quite good. I think some of the balance, and this is speaking out of turn, on the GDPR side is almost security theatre. I think the fact that we have to all click, show me my cookies, everyone just clicks it, is security theatre. It's not actually achieving anything, but I get the intent, and I also appreciate the fact that they're thinking about it. And so I think that it's that fine regulatory balance between overburden the market, but also making sure you've got the controls to support the entities. And I think that there is an okay balance here, but they're still proving it out. Like, the legislation in Australia is under 10 years old for like the for breach of information and all that jazz. So it's still being proofed out in court cases and instances, and that testing of what is willful negligence, I think, is still being right leveled, if that makes sense. And I think in a few years, when we see more of those cases come through, and as the legislation changes, I think that we'll have a better feel for, is it providing the right level of assurance? But the problem is, as you know, the cost of entry for attackers at the moment is so low that that I mentioned before, the defender's dilemma, but it's not if you'll get breached, it's when you'll get breached, and that comes back to the how do you detect and respond to breaches to minimize the consequences of it.
Yeah, I mean, this point is one of the points that I bring up in almost every conversation where somebody says, "Oh yeah, but we're not a target," and I said, "Well, first of all, everybody's a target." And the example that I like to give to people is like, and I always mention this: two things that people you got to be aware of. Number one, hackers have credit cards. They may or may not be accurate credit cards, but what it does give them is it gives them access to cloud, and it gives them access to, and number two, hackers have internet connections, and they can go scan GitHub. They can get every open source automation tool, Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, all of these tools that have good legitimate use cases for pen testing and for hardening your own applications can also be used by the other side, right? And so like you couple cloud automation and, in open source, and I'll tell you that everybody's a target. Our own lab environment, we stand up APIs on a regular basis to test our own product with them, to test exploits, attacks, etc. Every single API we put online with just a randomly assigned IP address gets traffic within about 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, and the whole internet is being scanned perpetually. Constantly. And not just scanned, by the way. Scanned with some intelligence. Yeah, actively targeted. 100%.
Exactly. Because we see this behavior where it's like, oh, I got a response from random IP address 1234. Let me see if it's running WordPress. Let me see if it's running Drupal. Let me see if it's running MoveIt file transfer software. Again and again, let me see if I can find secrets, credentials, environment variables, any of these things that I might use to breach the organization or map it out or understand what's running there. That's all valuable.
Well, and I've actually seen, sorry to interrupt, but I've seen instances of that where the people are running that software and they're not even using it to compromise it themselves. They're automating that. Basically they'll compromise your machine every time you type in a password. They're not even going to use it to breach you. They're just putting it straight onto the dark web to sell, because that's how they make money. They do that at scale. That they're not even the one that attacks you. They sell it onto someone else who attacks you. They're the initial access broker, effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
And we had an instance in government where a member of the public's credentials were compromised through this method. They were part of a botnet, and they were available for sale on the dark web, and we got access to, this is the credential that was broken, that was compromised. And with that one credential, which cost you about $2 US, you could have rolled over their entire life savings, their super, which was about $700,000 instantly, because they're over 65 in Australia. So it's like 100%. And one funny thing about, how people say it's what they would never target me. Working in my role at Parliament House, I heard that same thing from everyone up the chain. It was no one thinks that they're going to be targeted. It's a universal opinion. No, everyone says, "Oh, I wouldn't be targeted." I'm like, everyone is targeted. You are targeted by existing.
Yeah. I mentioned our lab environments. One of the other things that's happened to us at work, we're a tiny company. We're a 12-person organization spread across a few different geographies. Yes, we work with customers around the world, etc. Just the other day, I was checking my spam folder and I saw impersonation emails with the names of my employees telling me that they needed to update their bank account information on our payroll system. And everybody's targeted, everybody is automated. It's trivial to discover who works in an organization and then to catch their names and so on and put that in there. So,
and
look,
just,
Toby, sorry, go ahead.
Just on that before we divide, the other thing that's a driver for that is the level of poverty in some countries means that if they get one person to accidentally send them $50 once a month, they've made their quota. And so then sending 1,000 emails costs them only their time. And so, again, that's scale. Sorry to interrupt, but that's the perfect example of if they can get one pay sent to them, not sent to you, then they're set for the month. They can eat for the month.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting point there that you kind of said in passing, which is hit their quota. You've got to remember that these individuals are generally part of larger organizations that are criminal enterprises fundamentally. And that's correct. Yes, maybe nation states aren't targeting you. Maybe. Right? Maybe if you work in critical infrastructure, they are. But maybe for me as a small cybersecurity company working on API security software, maybe nation states are not targeting me, but criminal enterprises absolutely are.
100%.
And, we've only got a couple more minutes, but I know there were a couple of other things I really wanted to get your take on as somebody who's been doing this for a little while. And that's, when we think about kind of this transitioning environment as we move further and further into the cloud, I tend to think of cloud as actually being better from a cybersecurity perspective. Why? Because everything can be kind of programmed, right? Everything's software defined. It can be interacted with over APIs. It's primarily data and configurations that I'm worried about. I'm kind of curious to get your lens because, let's say like globally, there's a perception that government organizations are typically a little bit behind that curve when it comes to cloud adoption. And they may have more legacy IT than IT infrastructure than a born in the cloud organization like us. How do you view that? And then what are some of your top recommendations for organizations that are either going through a transition or struggling to manage kind of legacy IT infrastructure?
I think the biggest challenge for me is not just the legacy IT infrastructure, but also the legacy IT infrastructure personnel, because often they'll bring the same approach that they take to managing on-prem to into the cloud, if that makes sense. So you have to do the people, process, and technology uplift as you migrate. And I see a lot of the ways where it fails is because they're just trying to basically do what they were doing on-prem in the cloud. And as you probably know from a cloud journey, that also doesn't cost less. If you just move your machines into IaaS, you're just spending more money. So you're not actually achieving the benefits of the cloud. It doesn't give you the scalability. It gives you the redundancy and that piece, but you're not baking into your apps the scale up, scale down. You're not baking in the automated security controls. So for me, it's about going, when we move to the cloud, do it with purpose and move each application with intention. One of the approaches and an agency I used, they did like a gold, silver, bronze, rust approach, where they took a catalog of their apps and they went, gold is we move it to SaaS, and then we just manage the policy. Silvers, we move it to PaaS. Bronze, we move it to IaaS. Rust, we can't move it and we've got to kill it because it's stuck. So structure it and work out your approach. There's been a number of instances recently where people have just lifted and shifted directly into the cloud, and unfortunately that shifted their problems into the cloud, and your problems can go at scale in the cloud and exposed to the internet very quickly. So it's about, for me, the biggest fundamental piece is making sure you have the right knowledge in the right people to do that transition, and don't use the same tools you used for on-prem to achieve your outcomes in the cloud. And work really clearly to layer your controls up from the base so that you bake in, if you're doing an IaaS or PaaS implementation, you understand what the controls are for the shell, and then everyone that works within it works within their piece. And if you can, build natively in a zero trust way as you migrate to the cloud, because that's the other benefit you can do, which is stop the east-west traffic, get everyone coming through a front door automatically, whether that's Azure front door or an AWS app gateway or whatever partner client.
Yep.
But if you can natively do that as part of the migration, you just remove those east-west vectors, so someone can't jump into a desktop and then pivot into your environment. So the two main things I would say is don't treat it like you treat on-prem, so get the right skills, and then bake in zero trust and identity as a front when you're doing it, because otherwise you can't retrofit it. This is the perfect chance to do it properly once.
Yeah. To that point, along those lines of the second thing that you said is retrofitting is really tough. I've seen organizations that made that transition exactly as you said. They kind of went the classic lift and shift. They didn't change their operations model at all. They got into the cloud and then they realized really we're just using someone else's data center at this point. At best, we got out of hardware management. And yes, it is quite costly, right, at that point. And you can do a little bit of like financial optimization with contract mechanisms and reservations and capacity commitments. All fine. Yes. But when you're really trying to get, let's say, the benefits of the cloud and let's say the flexibility and the ephemeral nature and the scale up and the scale down and the scale out and all that good stuff, you really have to change your operations model. Correct. And to that point, what I've seen with organizations that kind of make the lift and shift mistake, or frankly, I've often seen they wait until the very end and it's like data center end of life or end of colo contract. And they're like, oh crap, we got to get out of here. Let's just lift and shift. What they inevitably end up doing is then creating a new cloud organization, and they do a cloud to cloud migration to go from the lift and shift operations into the actual cloudy way of getting it done. And look, that can work, but it is not cost effective. Anyway.
Correct.
Awesome.
Correct. And it's always easier said than done. I understand that people have apps that are older than me running that that are critical to the delivery of services. So I totally get it.
Yeah, and by the way, those apps are probably powering your bank account and mine and every flight reservation that we're making around the world on a regular basis. So, some of them are pretty important. So I do get that as well. Awesome. Well, Toby, it's been a real pleasure. I don't know if you have any closing comments you want to share with the audience, but I know from my standpoint, I've really enjoyed learning about some of the challenges relative to the Australian market, some of the guidance coming out there. For any closing thoughts or anybody who wants to get in touch, where can they find you? What would you share with them?
If anyone wants any help, feel free to reach me out on LinkedIn. But for me, the biggest driver is how we as a community engage with the business. And the benefit of the Essential 8 and those conversations, as you said, is having a simplified engagement model. And that's really telling for me. The biggest benefit of the Essential 8 is the consumption from the business and the engagement on that side. So think about your narrative. As I mentioned before, the only thing that's important is how you articulate what's important. And if you're not ahead of that narrative as a cyber professional within your organization, then you're not going to succeed at all. So make sure you think about the people and how you sell your piece and then tie your deliverables to that.
That's a great point, and I think that's a great note to end today's conversation on. Toby, thank you so much for joining us on the Modern Cyber Podcast.
Thank you for your time, Jeremy.